Where are we today in this? I mean, because the only thing that keeps sort of resonating in my head is President Obama's "My Brother's Keeper" program, I think it was called, which seems to me to be, I mean, sort of still adopting that same sort of perspective that this is that we're looking at like a cultural problem. I mean, this remains fairly consistent throughout. I mean, doesn't it? Throughout 80s, 90s to now.
Yes, I mean we don't even during the Reagan administration. There's not much talk about. There's a lot of talk about cultural pathology, but there's not much funding for social welfare programs. And actually, that's when we really begin to see kind of massive disinvestment from spending on social welfare and public assistance. But certainly, I mean, I think these ideas about Black cultural pathology have kind of shaped the American imagination since its founding, and it's much easier, and as policymakers themselves admitted, in the kind of like short term, it's easier to kind of blame the victim than it is to really kind of come to terms with historical racism and economic inequality in our society, to say, okay, it's actually, if we want to solve these problems of inequality and poverty, then it's the personal, this is Obama's language, kind of Black Americans' own personal responsibility to solve that. But that doesn't recognize, as you mentioned, the kind of systemic exclusion that, I mean, even just within the post-war period, we begin to see with housing and who has access to housing and who has access to benefits and the GI Bill. So until we really come to terms with these kind of larger structural transformations in American history, the inequalities that we see and kind of this consistent embrace of punitive responses to social problems will kind of continue to steer much of our domestic policy. One of the things that the book, I think, really demonstrates is that this approach to socioeconomic inequality and exclusion, dealing with that with police and surveillance programs and locking people up, has not worked to alleviate fundamental inequalities and disadvantage in our society. And so it's very discouraging to see that the Trump administration is kind of going back and embracing these more draconian, hard-nosed policies that law enforcement officials themselves, many of them, recognize now as complete failures. They haven't effectively controlled crime and violence in certain communities, and we now have this major problem of mass incarceration that's a further drain on state resources. So I think part of it is we've really got to embrace a different kind of thinking about prevention that goes beyond pathology, that goes beyond personal responsibility, and that begins to think about how we can redistribute basic resources and begin to make that kind of investment, that kind of Marshall Plan the Kerner Commission suggested, in low-income areas, and maybe not just in urban centers, but also in rural areas where there exists extreme disadvantage and marginalization as well.
All right, so one last question on this, because I'm just curious if this is if there's a trap here, because on one level, as you're saying that, it occurs to me that let's put aside Trump for a moment to the extent that we can not have him in the forefront of our minds, but there was a budding, nascent movement that was trans ideological, if you will, to reform our penal system, right? I mean, there was conservatives and if addressing it from that perspective, that the problem is the carceral state, if that isn't falling into that same trap, or does both have to happen simultaneously? One, I think both. All right, go ahead.
No. You go ahead. Please lay it out.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that you understood my question was just that, if we address the carceral state as the problem, as opposed to the carceral state is an outgrowth and a function of another sociological, economic problem that we have, are we falling into that same trap again, or do we?
Right.
Go ahead.
So that's, I mean, that's part of what is, the fiscal arguments about that really have led to, some of the like right on crime, Newt Gingrich and the Koch brothers kind of embracing, people who are on the right embracing this criminal justice reform moment only because it is not sustainable for states. I mean, the root cause of so much of this has to do with racism, and has to do with, so it's in part really coming to terms with the ways that racism, after the civil rights movement and kind of the rise of incarceration and policing programs and, our kind of changes in sentencing and this real punitive turn in domestic policies, how that is not just rooted in, is very much rooted in racism, inequality that has really defined this nation historically. So partly it's coming in terms of that, but also the real problems that we're facing in terms of unemployment and lack of real opportunities for mobility for low-income Americans across the country, not just in urban centers, everywhere. So part of it is dealing with the impacts of the decline of domestic manufacturing and the transition to a skilled and service economy. And the other is really dealing with racism and the ways in which consistently incarceration and policing programs become a kind of solution to new racial orders, first that emerged, we begin to see the rise of the convict leasing system, et cetera, after emancipation, and then following civil rights, we get this new modernized law enforcement where police officers are taking on new roles in urban centers. So until we deal with racism and inequality in this country and the kind of historic undercurrents of that, reforming criminal justice is not going to be enough to really lessen inequality in America.
Elizabeth Hinton, the book is From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos